Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm going to go over a couple of discussion type exercises. Typically we do this in like a Thursday or Friday and think about talking about these concepts and then talking through this with groups. Obviously I'm not going to do that with COVID, and so I'm just going to go over these exercises and kind of talk about the types of things we would have gone over. So basic idea is in this video, I'm going to talk about these three questions in terms of answering some issues pertaining to production costs. So production costs refer to things like our cost curves: average total cost, average variable cost, average fixed cost, marginal cost, variable cost, and total cost. And so anyway, the questions I've got is: first, suppose we have average total cost falling. What must be true of marginal cost? Suppose average total cost is rising. What must be true of marginal cost? Explain using a picture. Two, assume the only variable factor of production is labor. There's no output when there's no workers employed. Suppose further the average total cost of producing 5 units is 30. Marginal cost of producing the 6th unit is 60. Compute the average total cost of producing 6 units. Show your work, explain your reasoning. And then 3, sometimes albums are released online for download at very inexpensive price. Examples would be Louis C.K.'s comedy performances from his website and Radiohead's In Rainbows Pay What You Wish strategy. Describe the relevant costs such as fixed costs, variable costs, marginal costs, and why these strategies can be successful. All right, so obviously I've got the picture for number 1 and the work for number 2, but let's kind of talk through what's going on here. So when the average cost curve is falling, what must be true of the marginal cost curve? Whenever the average cost curve is falling, marginal cost must be lower than average cost. It's bringing down the average, right? Marginal cost is below average total cost, right? Marginal cost is like vertically lower than average total cost when average total cost is falling. What's true of marginal cost when average total cost is rising? Marginal cost is pulling up the average. It's above average total cost when average total cost is rising. So beyond the graphical explanation, notice marginal cost crosses average total cost from below at its minimum. You can think about like a batting average for like a softball or baseball team or something like this. Think of like the players' average for a particular game versus their average for the season. If they have a particularly good game where they don't strike out, and so their average for the day would be like perfect, would be a 1.0, then that would raise their average. However, suppose they only hit 1 out of 3 times, now their average would be 0.33. That's actually probably pretty good. There's a lot of baseball players, a lot of softball players that would love to have batting average of 33% over the course of the season. That's super high. So anyway, but if your batting average for a particular game is lower than your season average, it'll pull down the marginal pulls down the average. Same thing with like GPA. If you have a good semester, it raises your career GPA. It's like the marginal. If you have a bad semester, that's like the marginal. It lowers your career GPA. And then in the long run, the average is sort of like evening out across all these. All right, so that's the first one. That's the picture. The key part of the picture, beyond the fact that marginal cost is rising when marginal cost is above average total cost whenever average total cost is rising, and marginal cost is below average total cost whenever average total cost is falling. The other key picture is that this must cross average total cost from below at its minimum. So the minimum average total cost must be where marginal cost crosses it. All right. Part 2. So here, this at first glance is an algebraic manipulation, but there's actually something kind of cool relative to the concepts behind it, which is why I asked the question. So here we want to look at what we've been given. We've been given the average total cost of producing 5 units. Average total cost is total cost divided by output. So this is going to be total cost divided by 5 is 30. So total cost is 150. Marginal cost of the 6th unit is 60, so 150 plus 60 gives me the total cost of 6 units, divided by 6 gives me the average total cost of producing 6 units. Right? So when I said it kind of conceptually, hopefully you can kind of follow along with that. That's all we're doing here with the math. That's all that's doing. Saying average total cost of 5 units was 30. Marginal cost of the 6th is 60. So total cost is going to be 150 plus the 60 is the 210, and then divide by 6 gives me my 35. The last one, think about this distribution strategy for performances, for content, where maybe you have like a pay what you wish sort of strategy. What's going on here is there's a really large fixed cost of making the performance, of generating it, writing it, performing it, producing it. And then there's a really low marginal cost, near zero marginal cost of selling another download. Interestingly, because the variable costs are near zero, right? If the marginal cost of selling an additional download is pretty near zero, the variable costs over time are pretty near zero. So fixed costs are going to be the most substantial component of total cost. Total cost is just fixed cost plus variable cost. Well, we know fixed cost crashes down to zero as output increases. You're spreading out that same fixed amount over more and more units. Variable cost tends to rise, though here probably not. Here variable cost probably stays pretty close to zero. Marginal cost is certainly zero. So average total cost probably crashes down pretty low, right? So you probably have a picture kind of like this. Oops, I'm having trouble raising this onto my screen. So average fixed cost always tends near zero. Let me talk about that for a second. Suppose the fixed cost is 1,000. Suppose you produce 1 unit. Average fixed cost is 1,000. Suppose fixed cost is 1,000 and you produce 1,000 units. Now average fixed cost is 1. Right? So average fixed cost falls as output increases. Average total cost is typically U-shaped, typically falling when average fixed cost is dominating. And then as average fixed cost tends towards zero, then average total cost rises when average variable cost is the dominant effect. But here, average variable cost is probably pretty close to zero throughout. Maybe it's actually zero. So then average total cost is going to fall down. But that's relevant because average total cost is going to be related to the minimum price you'd need to break even. And so I had actually like a little bit more of an elegant write-up over here. So here's like the verbal write-up. And so let me go over this. I don't know. I'll just kind of leave this for the other ones, but I'll talk about number 3. When producing an album, there's a really large fixed cost of recording, producing, finishing the work. There's a large fixed cost associated with establishing the web presence, distribution infrastructure, bandwidth, so on and so forth. But there's a near zero marginal cost associated with allowing one more download. What they're really hoping for is a really large volume of downloads. In doing so, their output rises, driving down average total cost. If you think about it, average fixed cost tends towards zero always, for the reason I just said. Here, average variable cost is barely rising, so average total cost is pretty well driven by average fixed cost, and over a large output, it's driven down to zero. So the break-even point's falling down, so what they need is a really large volume, and then this cost structure makes sense. This distribution strategy makes sense, and it was actually incredibly profitable for both of those entities that I discussed in the example. Later on, we'll think about this in the context of price discrimination, because this is a way that firms are able to capture lower willingness to pay buyers, and they're able to get something from them, some revenue from these buyers who ordinarily wouldn't have purchased. Relatedly, you can think about the cost structure for and the pricing structure for Apple's iTunes store in terms of music videos, movies, TV, and so on and so forth. It's got a really similar sort of feature where there's a really large fixed cost of licensing and then of hosting, but there's a really low cost of distributing one more copy of the download. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a good night.